Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome you all to this 5th annual lecture for the Centre for Migration and Diaspora Studies. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Claire Alexandra, who's coming to talk to us today. Just to give you a little bit of background before we start, our centre is situated in the Anthropology Department. This is in fact a joint event with our Anthropology seminar. The centre is partly in anthropology because of the fact that the school's very first MA programme in Migration and Diaspora Studies came out of the Anthropology Centre. But I have to also say that the inspiration for that programme came from an anthropology course which is entitled The Anthropology of African and Asian Communities in British Society. Now, this was initiated in the 1980s by Lionel Kaplan and Helen Konitka, and I'd like to actually mention them because I think actually those roots have become very important in how migration and diaspora studies has grown across SOAS. At the time, the course was highly innovative, and it was the only one of its kind where an entire anthropology course was actually devoted to the study of African and Asian communities at home. So it was quite remarkable. But I also have to add that the origins of the centre are to be found in anthropology. The reason the centre's flourished really is because we've always been strongly transdisciplinary from the start, and we've also always built ourselves on a clear understanding that migration and diaspora studies needs both a broad perspective and multiple viewpoints. So, the involvement of development studies in particular, and I'd like to thank my colleague Tanya Kaiser, who is co-chair of the centre, deputy chair, or anyway, one of those things, I get confused. The involvement of post-colonial studies, other departments across the school has really ensured that we run a very lively seminar series, that our annual lectures always come from across the disciplines, and that we always get new cohorts of PhD students who bring exciting new research projects with them. And that, of course, is the lifeblood of any academic community. I also have to say that the success of the centre and its transdisciplinary perspective has been reflected in the fact that we've recently won a large research grant, which has made us a part of a network, COHAB, which is short for Diasporic Constructions of Home and Belonging, and trust me, it works if you drop the diasporic, so try that, which includes 6 other academic institutions as well as non-academic partners, which is funded by the Marie Curie Initial Training Network. And this lecture is a part of the programme of events made possible by that funding, so I'd like to thank them. But I'm particularly delighted to be introducing someone whose expertise is also in the study of migrant communities in Britain, a tradition that I've just mentioned we have within our anthropology department. And I think for me, Claire's work is representative of a generation of academics who've been conducting their research in the context of major changes that are happening in the ways that diaspora communities in Britain are studied. I would say that in the long distant past, there wasn't a lot on that, anthropologically speaking. We had a lot of sociological texts who talked about the so-called dark strangers in our midst, describing outsiders to the wider public and policymakers, and talking about how to make people fit in. Okay. We also moved within certain binaries. So we talked a lot about black and white society, and we constantly fretted about what to do with the idea of race. But I'd say that what happened was eventually a new generation of academics has emerged, many of them here because of their own migratory histories. And in that development, we have developed new languages and began to describe Britain in fundamentally different ways, and I would say Claire is a part of that shift. So we see a very different picture of Britain which begins to emerge when we start to look at ethnography as a far more rooted in political economy. We give considerations to historical perspectives, and we also think about ways of giving voice to the other. So to introduce Claire, she got her first degree in Oxford at English Literature, and I'm just mentioning that because I've come across many people recently who's had the same path, and I think it leads to quite innovative ways about thinking about doing ethnography and representation. Claire was at the LSE for quite some time and in the sociology department, and she's recently got a chair in Manchester. She's currently the editor of Identities and is also involved in a project called Bangla Stories, I believe, and is also very involved with the Runnymede Trust. So she's got many strings to her bow. Claire has worked on Black British youth identities, which resulted in the book, the seminal text, The Art of Being Black, which came out in 1996. And she went on to conduct a 5-year study amongst young Bangladeshi men, which was published as The Asian Gang in 2000, which was also very well received. And I just want to say a few words about that book. Sorry, Claire, because it must be always work that everybody refers to, but that's for a reason. And the book is remarkable in many ways, especially through its commitment to carry out a dialogical ethnography in the contact zones of South London, whilst at the same time rooting her research in the social, historical and political as well, which is no easy task. The book relates the experiences of young Bangladeshi men growing up in England. It gives them a voice, but it is also honest about the difficulties of dialogic exchange and the need to maintain a critical analysis, again not easily done. It's also, I think fascinatingly, highly reflexive, charting Claire's own personal journey through the course of her research. It is a very honest piece of work. Okay, and I always think the book is interesting because it came out in 2000, which is a year before 2001. So the nascent hysteria surrounding the idea of the Asian gang was really sort of like came to the fore in 2001 with the riots in the north of England, September 11th, which somehow in imaginations have become conflated, if you like, to help create a narrative of the sort of problematic Muslim other. And it was really through doing this research that Claire was pushed into looking at the wider picture of Bengali migration to Britain. And I think Claire's subsequently done a follow-up study with the young men she looked at, and also worked on an ethnography of Brick Lane, as well as looking at longer migratory histories. So today, Claire is going to talk about the struggle over Bangladeshi identity in Tower Hamlets in a talk entitled Contested Memories, the Shahid Minar and the Struggle for Diasporic Space.
Firstly, I want to thank Paru for the invitation to come and give the annual lecture for the Centre of Migration and Diaspora Studies. I'm delighted to be part of such an exciting initiative, and I've been fortunate enough to work as the external examiner on the Centre's Master's programme for the last year, so it may be that some of you will be looking at your work later on in the year. And I've been witness of the excellence of the teaching in this area and the really exciting and innovative work that's being undertaken by the students. So I know that I'm kind of going to be talking to an engaged and informed and challenging audience, so I'm slightly nervous about doing that. We'll see. What I'm going to talk about today arises from a larger 3-year AHRC funded project on the Bengal Diaspora. The project ran from 2006 to 2009, and it was a study of migration from and within, because we looked at the kind of way in which the border came down and people moved across it, the Indian state of Bengal in the period following partition. It's been estimated that over 20 million people were displaced or migrated during this period across the kind of 60 years or so since. It's one of the largest migrations of the modern era. And of those, most of them moved across borders, or in some cases the borders moved across them and they suddenly found themselves in different countries. And about 2% moved overseas, mainly to the Middle East and to the UK, but you can pretty much find Bengalis everywhere. Everywhere there's a restaurant, effectively. The project was a multidisciplinary one, and it brought together a partition historian, my colleague Joya Chatterjee, an anthropologist and a development studies person from SOAS, who were the researchers on the project, and then myself, who was briefly an anthropologist and turned sociologist. And the project collected life histories of Muslim migrants in India and Bangladesh, and also in the UK. And this is just a slide of the sites that we worked in the UK. And we mainly worked in 2 sites in London, Tower Hamlets, which I'm going to talk about today, and which everybody talks about when they talk about Bangladeshis. Newham, because that's where a lot of those populations are moving to. Oldham, which is the kind of second largest Bangladeshi community in Britain, and often overlooked, but has its own kind of interesting dynamic. And then we looked at a kind of network of restaurant workers and brides, so we looked at kind of little pockets of people across the UK. What we were interested in looking at in this project was migration from below. How were the lives of very ordinary people, the kind of people whose voices and stories very rarely get heard and told, affected by, shaped by, and how did they shape the big events of post-partition India or post-war imperial Britain? And we collected over 180 interviews, some photographs, some family histories, and so on. We're currently working on the monograph from this project, but we worked with the Runnymede Trust, which is a race equality organisation, to take those stories and try and bring them to young people. So this was a website, the Bangla Stories website, which was produced for kids aged kind of 11 to 14 years old. And it's a way of getting them to kind of engage with the stories of migration, which often don't really get told. So if you're interested in the project more broadly than I'm going to talk about, a very tiny piece of it today, then I would direct you to that website. There's some nice pictures, apart from anything else. Now, the bigger project was concerned in particular with how diaspora movement and settlement can and must be understood empirically and historically. So I was interested in what Paru was saying just earlier. Also in relation to the structures of powers, particularly the powers of the nation state, and in relation to particular, often quite small local spaces. So we were looking at a range of different kinds of levels. And the challenge for us as a multidisciplinary research team was to bring together what were very different understandings of what diaspora meant, quite divergent understandings between the kind of my colleague who's a historian and myself as a sociologist, and some tensions around how we thought that could be approached empirically. And so what I'm going to do today is explore some of those tensions around the understanding of diaspora through one very small, quite intimate example that came out of the fieldwork. As Paru said, I'm primarily actually a sociologist of race and ethnicity in Britain. So my interest was very much shaped around the kind of UK and what diaspora meant for changing some of the discourses in the UK. So it spoke to questions of race, ethnicity and difference in a way that actually were quite different from the research that was conducted in the South Asian end, where questions of race certainly are not a primary feature. But one issue that particularly interested me personally was the issue of space and how certain spaces and places get read through the lens of race or ethnicity or difference, and how those dominant national external discourses can be challenged by more demotic, to use kind of Bauman's term, internal discourses, the more kind of chaotic and uncertain discourses, and how those internal discourses are themselves fragmented in quite complex ways. And I'm going to talk about this in relation to religion at the end of the talk. So to explore this kind of more located issue, as part of that bigger project, I conducted a series of interviews around Brick Lane in East London. And unlike the broader project where we wanted to speak to people who didn't normally get to kind of air their experience and histories, I was interested in people who had had active kind of shaping roles in terms of how that community had developed over the past 40 years. So it's mainly those interviews that I'm drawing on today. So it's a project within a project, if you like. And some of this material was published in an article in the British Journal of Sociology last year, if you're interested around the Brick Lane stuff. But I wanted to take another kind of angle at it. And I'm drawing on a paper which will come out in Ethnic and Racial Studies next year. So I'm going to use that as the basis for what I'm talking about. And I chose to focus on this partly because I've got some nice pictures that kind of come with it, so I thought it would be easier to engage with. But also because I think the example captures some of the tensions and ambiguities of doing research on diaspora and theorising diaspora. So before I get into the empirical example, I want to start with a few short and tentative reflections on theorising diaspora. I'm not a theorist, so they will be pretty tentative. But in particular, the tension between the two kind of opposing strands in diaspora research. And I want to think about how bringing those two strands together empirically and in relation to particular geographical sites and particular historical moments provides some interesting and revealing insights into diaspora identities. And that, I'm going to do that using the example of the Shahid Minar. Okay, so a little theoretical short interlude. It's almost certainly true to say that studies of diaspora have proliferated insanely in the last 30 years, particularly since the 1980s, and that accordingly the concept has been subjected to what we might think of as theoretical stretch. So from a very specific focus initially on particular historical paradigms, the Jewish or the black diasporas being the kind of obvious ones, paradigms which focused on forced dispersal from a shared place of origin and ongoing myths of return, the concept's expanded in the past 3 decades to pretty much include anything, any experience where there has been any movement of any kind. So this includes what we might think of as classic forms of economic migration, labour and trade migration. It covers now cultural diasporas, so the kind of spread of certain kind of cultural forms and practices, transnational communities with strong tangible links to the homeland rather than any kind of direct break, so moving away from all those definitional characteristics of diaspora initially. It now covers a whole range of marginalised statuses such as refugees, exiles, guest workers, immigrants in general. What Robin Cohen, who I understand was the speaker last year, it's become a master trope of migration and settlement. But it's also been used to refer to settled ethnic minority communities or networks. So networks where people are kind of everywhere and have no point of origin, shared point of origin. So Brubaker, for example, has talked of the expansion of the term to include the deaf diaspora, the queer diaspora, the digital diaspora. I'm sure I heard a paper or saw a paper being advertised which referred to the terrorist diaspora, which I thought was an interesting kind of stretch. So and we've also seen the popularisation of the term. So we can think of it as a kind of form of conceptual drift. So now you see it a lot in the media, even in political discourses, where diaspora communities have become a kind of euphemism for racial and ethnic difference. And I always think that when politicians and the press latch onto a term, it's probably time to find a new term, usually. So on the one hand, we have the expansion of the term, so we can all claim that we're all diasporic now, in which case it's completely meaningless. And on the other, we can see it as a way in which it becomes reduced to a kind of very pathologized term for marking difference. And I think both of those forms, the expansion and the pathologization of the term, are developments which are at odds with the original critical potential of diaspora as a concept. Part of the popularity of diaspora was in recognizing and capturing some of those more complex experiences of migration, movement and settlement, and the way in which contemporary societies have been transformed in the past century and more intensively in the past 30 years. In its more recent formation and reclamation, it's worked alongside concepts like hybridity, transnationalism, post-coloniality, new ethnicities, all of which are kind of often used interchangeably actually, to unsettle ideas around nationhood, citizenship, home and belonging. It's been used politically by academics, artists, practitioners, ethnic minority communities as a way of staking a claim or making a place or making space. The focus has been very much on migration and settlement from below, more people-centred, messier, and in that challenging reified ideas of identity and belonging. It can be seen as a kind of more positive substitute then, if you like, for that more maligned concept of multiculturalism, which nobody now talks about. And these concepts have been really powerful in dismantling taken for granted ideas around race and ethnicity. And this is important and continues to be important in a context, particularly political but also policy framework, which still relies on very bounded and very policed notions of identity. But even these more critical, progressive engagements can be criticised and have been criticised, largely for focusing on diaspora communities in the North and West, for being overly focused on the experiences of minorities bounded by the nation states. This is my friend and colleague Brett St. Louis calls it the problem of a diaspora community in Britain or in wherever. So actually it tends not to think across boundaries, interestingly. And also James Clifford has criticised the concept for positioning minorities as being permanent strangers, for marking them out as being different, for being what he's termed as not here to stay, turning that kind of 1970s slogan on its head. Now, some of these tensions arise inevitably from the contradiction at the heart of diaspora itself, that it relies on an appeal to some shared origin or place or ancestry or history as the basis for contemporary solidarities, for what Gilroy calls diaspora consciousness, at the same time as it then tries to unpack or dismantle or fracture that notion of belonging. And this tension can be traced to two approaches to diaspora, which I've termed, borrowing from Stuart Hall, the distinction between empirical and metaphorical diasporas. So empirical diasporas placing diaspora as a kind of historical reality, or what Brubaker calls an entity, something that categorises people and describes people, that allows you to measure and count and quantify, and that can be traced over time and space. It's a really useful device. So if you think of the Bengal Diaspora project, for example, that version of diaspora, which is actually a more historical version, if you think about it in terms of discipline, that's the foundation which allows me to say 20 million Bengali migrants have moved in the period since 1947. It allows me to trace those movements across different spaces and different times, and it allows for a framework of coherence. So when we produce our book on the Bengal diaspora, we're fudging the issue that we're talking about massively different experiences across those different spaces, different groups, and so on. And this version of diaspora appeals to very clear roots, R-O-O-T-S, and boundaries. And it has a strong appeal for evoking a strong sense of belonging and solidarity. But, and the downside is, and the reason it's considered unfashionable, I think, is because it has potential for reinforcing very essentialized ideas of origin, of belonging, homogenizing and reducing very complex experiences, and privileging the politics of the homeland, in inverted commas. You should consider inverted commas quite a lot of the way through this talk, actually, over the politics of settlement. Now, the second version, which is, I think, one which appeals much more to sociologists, and I don't know which side of this kind of divide you might fall as people who are interested in this area. This is the version that sees diaspora more as a process or as a stance, in Brubaker's term. It's a form of engagement, it's a way of opening up spaces, which are as much a product of imagination as history or culture or origin. And the primary motif here isn't of homeland, but of journeys. It's a matter of becoming rather than being, in Hall's evocative phrase. And it's probably true to say that sociology and cultural studies have been more interested in this really much sexier theoretical concept, in transformation, change and multiplicity, with roots R-O-U-T-E-S rather than roots, the other version. Accordingly, and I think this is where part of the problem lies, we have a really overdeveloped suspicion of anything that looks too much like solidarity or sameness or continuity or tradition or group or community, because it smacks of essentialism. And essentialism is effectively the eighth deadly sin to pretty much any British sociologist. Less so, I think, in other parts of the world. And the metaphorical diaspora, this imagined diaspora, is concerned with disjuncture, translation, with where you're at rather than where you're from, to paraphrase Gilroy's term. And it has spatial and temporal dimensions. So sociologists are more concerned with here rather than there, with now and next rather than with then. The past in particular is imagined and narrated largely as a way of positioning the present and imagining the future. So Brubaker's argued that we should think of diaspora, this is a quote, in the first instance as a category of practice. It does not so much describe the world as seek to remake it. And there is, of course, a third way. There's always a third way, particularly with sociologists. I think of this as the Goldilocks solution, right? Bring those together, which seeks to balance and reconcile those perspectives. So Stuart Hall has argued influentially, and rightly, I think, in my view, for the recognition of the role of history and power in the play of those kind of cultural identities. Researching diaspora, he says, requires a reckoning with both the place of history and continuity and of transformation and renewal in the context of broader power relations. Now, so far so familiar, I'm sure you're all very familiar with those kind of concepts. So what I want to pose are two questions before I move on to the empirical example. Firstly, I would argue that this works really well in theory, and it has largely remained at the level of theory. It's very easy to say things are complex and you should balance those things and then just ignore them when you try and apply them. And I would argue that in practice that has not very often successfully been achieved. So most of the empirical work, certainly in sociology on diaspora identities, has dealt with the question of history and power largely by ignoring it. So it's just talked quite a lot about multiplicity and complexity and ambiguity in a kind of free-floating way. And here I'm particularly arguing two things. Firstly, that we've tended to focus on difference and multiplicity and cultural practices, largely without looking at the broader social and historical context in which those things take shape. And in so doing, we're losing sight of the reason why diaspora is important. We've lost sight of why it matters. My second question, rather as well as the kind of what about in practice question, is to ask what happens when, as researchers of diaspora, we come across formations that don't deconstruct quite as nicely as we would want them to. So what happens when we stub our theoretical toe on the empirical realities, emotions, solidarities, which form the basis of collective actions or feelings of belonging? I think this is one of the reasons why we don't know what to do with the whole kind of homegrown terror debate, for example. We don't really know what to do when sometimes you just come across what seem like quite rigid formations, even though they may not actually be in practice. So what do? Do we ignore them? Do we dismiss them? Do we see them as a form of false consciousness? How do we build those into our kind of, the desire to deconstruct everything? And in my other life as an ethnographer of youth identities, and Paru was saying, I've just been revisiting the original participants in my Asian Gang project who are now in their early 30s. What I've become really interested in are those kind of ties, the ties that bind, if you want to kind of call them that. Moments where other formations of love and friendship and family and solidarity and community and some of the more negative sides of that take over for however momentary and however fraught those moments might be. What do you do with those kind of solid, hard kind of moments? Now, Stuart Hall's argued that diasporic cultural identity is, quote, always constructed through memory, fantasy, narrative, and myth. Diaspora identities are products of imagination and narration. They're stories, they're myths to some extent. But I would argue that those narrations are anchored in quite concrete and effective ways. They come with a whole lot of emotional baggage very often. One of the things that I found in the Brick Lane interviews that I did was that there's a really strong emotional investment in what people put into that area, which gives them a sense of entitlement, and one can deconstruct that or not, but it doesn't mean it's not there and not real. So one way of exploring these more complex and intangible dimensions of diaspora is to focus on the way in which they take shape in particular locations, and to focus explicitly on the kind of ideas of space and time in those particular locations. And I'm not thinking of space here primarily, although it's partly about physical space, but the way in which space is made or claimed and fought over through the movement of people and the passage of time. And one way in which space can be claimed is through performance, so things like festivals like the Boishakhi Mela, and memorializations like the Shahid Minar and the Ekushe ceremony, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And these rituals of diaspora become part of what Avatar Brar has called the everyday stories we tell ourselves individually and collectively. And of course, they're multiple and contested and resisted, and they take shape within broader historical, social, cultural and political fields. And they can also involve important forms of silencing and erasure. So I want to try and explore some of that. Having just said that, this is normally where most sociologists leave it. I'm now going to try and explore that empirically through the intimate lens of one particular diaspora space, the Shahid Minar in Tower Hamlets. And what I'm going to try and do is open up this site as a prism through which to view some of the ways in which diaspora, community and cultural identity are created and performed, and the way in which that performance is contested in the shifting time and space of London. So I'm going to do this by looking at a variety of levels, all of which I'm going to separate out and that very neatly, but actually, of course, are massively intertwined, and try and point to some of those interconnections as I go through. So, okay, that's the theory done. Now I'm going to just tell you a few stories. Okay, so the Shahid Minar translates as Tower of the Martyrs. This is the one in Altabali Park at the end of Brick Lane. So this is a picture of Altabali Park, which Shahzad took by researchers. I did mention you earlier, actually, but you came in, you must have missed that. So Altabali Park, which stands opposite to Brick Lane, the end of Brick Lane. So you can see this on the map. And actually, just bear in mind later on when I come to talk about the position of Altabali Park, which is not that far away from East London Mosque, and then Brick Lane Mosque is about halfway up the first part of Brick Lane. The Shahid Minar was constructed in its permanent form in 1999. It's a replica of one in Oldham. Oldham were very happy that they got the first Shahid Minar, so in the UK. And it's a very less well-known but very well-established Bengali community. And of course the site of riots in 2001. And that is itself a copy of the original in Dhaka. The original Shahid Minar stands near the Dhaka Medical College and was built as a memorial to the Bengali language martyrs who were killed by police in 1952 for demonstrating against the attempt to impose Urdu as the national language of East Pakistan, which is of course now Bangladesh. And that moment, which was usually held to mark the beginning of the Bengali nationalist movement, which ended with the Liberation War and the independence of Bangladesh in 1971. So the monument symbolises a mother with her fallen sons, backed by the red rising sun, which is resonant of the Bangladeshi national flag. So it encapsulates the idea of national beginnings and national sacrifice as a way of creating those beginnings through the blood of the language martyrs. As such, the memorial concretises an emotional, historic and imaginative link to Bangladesh's liberation struggle and the nation which emerged from it. Now, the Shahid Minar in London, as elsewhere, is a primary site for a version of a kind of nationalist-inflected identity work in East London, but also across the UK and across the world. And this picture was taken by Shahzad, in fact, who braved the February air. I have to say I really didn't want to be anywhere at midnight on the 21st of February. So at midnight on the 21st of February each year, Ekushe, which is a memorial service for the language martyrs, is held at the Shahid Minar. In East London, it's attended by around 200 and 300 Bengalis from East London, and also people that have travelled in from potentially quite far afield. Wreaths are laid around the monument. You can see those on this picture. And there are speeches by local community leaders and representatives of political and cultural organisations. So it is, if you like, it's a lived performance of those links to Bangladesh, to its history, to the remembrance of national struggle, to a set of intertwined values that come with that around secularism, the importance of language, the importance of culture and nationalism. So it's a claiming of a national and cultural identity that privileges notions of shared origin, of belonging and of roots, R-O-O-T-S. I wish, anyway, there's no easy way of doing that. One woman I interviewed who runs a local Bengali cultural organisation told me, quote, "It's my identity, it's our identity. If I don't mark it, I don't know my roots." So Ekushe performs this transnational link in its absence. It calls into being, if you like, a sense of belonging in the context of displacement in time and in space. So in this sense, you could see it as a classic diaspora performance. It looks back geographically and temporally in search of a collective identity. And there is that which is part of it. At the same time, however, the conjuring of time and space are multiple and complex. The performance of Ekushe conjures elsewheres, not only in Bangladesh itself, but also Bengali diaspora communities across the UK and across the world. And it also conjures elsewhens. So the memorial itself commemorates not only one event, but a series of events in which the language martyrs symbolise and provide a kind of staging post for a much longer and broader national struggle. So its apotheosis is reached nearly 2 decades later with the foundation of Bangladesh. And the annual ritual and the kind of investment in the annual ritual points to the unfinished process of nation building and to its victims. So, for example, the campaigns to gain recognition for the 3 million people murdered and the thousands of women that were raped during the Liberation War. So this ceremony in East London is coordinated by the UK branch of the Nirmal Committee, which is a group dedicated to the ongoing prosecution of war criminals, some of whom are in the UK, as well as engaging with contemporary Bangladeshi politics. So it's also about now and it's about the future. At the same time, as well as this kind of global story, transnational story, the monument and the act of memorialisation tell other stories, which speak to an alternate version of diaspora, and one which talks about the remaking of home in new places, in this case in Britain and in London. It's present-centred, both in spatial and temporal terms. It's about here and it's about now. So I want to explore some of those next, and I'm not going to be able to say very much because obviously of the time, but give you at least a flavour of some of these dimensions. Okay, so the next level I want to explore is the national level, and the way in which the Shahid Minar speaks to the position of the Bangladeshi community in Britain and also particularly in Tower Hamlets. I'm going to use these interchangeably. Excuse me. Partly because I haven't got time to separate out those kind of different specificities, but also because people always assume that Tower Hamlets is the Bangladeshi community in Britain. Very often it's claimed as, by a number of people we spoke to, as being the heartland of the Bangladeshi community. So there is that kind of internal sense. It's not just a convenient categorisation, though it is largely a convenient categorisation. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of Britain's Bangladeshi population lives in Tower Hamlets. It's the highest concentration anywhere in the UK. About half of those, of course, are born and bred in London. And the area and the Bengali community has been marked by a rather schizophrenic set of representations. Externally, in particular, Tower Hamlets has been marked through images of poverty, unemployment, poor education, poor health, bad housing, and so on. Tower Hamlets ranks 3rd out of 354 local boroughs for levels of multiple social deprivation. But at the same time, it has, through the development of Banglatown, the Boishaki Mela, and the Brick Lane Curry Festival from the mid-90s, there's been a reclaiming and positioning of this community as an iconic part of multicultural Britain through the restaurant trade and, of course, that whole notion of chicken tikka masala. And I've showed this so many times, I have to show this all the time because I love this photo. This is the day seat edition of the Monopoly game. And if you've seen this, it's basically got iconic sites of various Asian communities around the UK. So it's got streets in Bradford, it's got Birmingham, Soho Road, a whole range of different it's fantastic. And Tower Hamlets is there, so it is iconic. You can see the restaurant, the streets of restaurants and so on. But also it is, you know, it's where the Old Kent Road is on the classic board. It's £60. So it does have that kind of slightly ambiguous positioning. It's not in the Mayfair position. So that ambiguity is there. Now, Tower Hamlets stands as a symbolic site within the Bangladeshi community too, in different ways perhaps. It represents what several interviewees described to me as a safe haven for Bangladeshis and, as I said, the heartland of the community. The visible Bangladeshi presence locally, particularly since the regeneration in the 1990s, which saw the development of Banglatown, the founding of the Mela, the Banglatown Arch and all this other stuff, and established the Shahid Minar, has been viewed as underscoring this identity amongst Bengalis in Britain. So the chair of the Regeneration Committee that developed the Shahid Minar as part of this project told me that the Shahid Minar was important in creating a sense of Bengali identity in the UK, as it was a focal point for that. So he told me, and this is a quote, "Whatever happens, any Bengali that comes to this country or a Bengali who might move to Manchester, like me, and wants to have a connection with the Bengali community will come to Brick Lane and come to this Alta Valley Park." So that's why it's significant to have it there. So it becomes a kind of focal point. And the building of the Shahid Minar illustrates the engagement of the Bengali community within wider British society. It's a way of claiming space within London, within East London and within Britain. So the permanent Shahid Minar was funded from within the community. 50 local groups and business people donated £500 each towards the structure. But it was done in conjunction with the local authority who provided the permissions on the land and the permissions on the structure. Before this, one activist told me, Bengalis were observing Martyr's Day by creating a temporary Shahid Minar with wooden planks and stuff and using community centres. So they've been doing it for years, since 1952, but it's nothing new. But then the council thought we ought to have a permanent monument. Now there's another important side story here, which is about the role of the local Labour Party in East London and the way in which this has been dominated by Bangladeshi councillors from the 1980s onwards as a kind of deliberate strategy, actually. So it's possible to see the establishment of a permanent monument as a coming of age of the Bengali community. It's a recognition of their presence, an increased confidence and visibility and contribution to an area in a broader context of a kind of global city that at the point that the Shahid Minar was built hadn't yet kind of given up the idea of a multicultural London or Britain. But again, this presence, this kind of contemporary presence conjures other times, again locally inflected. So it testifies to the long and historic linkages binding Bengal and Sylhet in particular to Britain through the nearby docks. Many of them served as sailors in the merchant navy. It's from the time of the East India Company through 2 world wars to the influx of workers from the 1960s, their families from the 1980s. And these challenge the dominant representations of Bengalis as being outsiders or latecomers to the British nation. I don't know if any of you read the New East End book, but there was very strong image there of Bengalis as being people that just kind of turned up and taken all the housing. Well, actually, you know, these kind of monuments point to this much longer history of engagement and exchange. The Shahid Minar is one of the landmarks on a new Bengali heritage trail through the area, which was sponsored by the National Lottery Heritage Lottery Fund. So it's worth doing that tour. It stands. These tours go alongside the kind of Jack the Ripper tour if you want to do those. I think the Bengali is probably less bloody. So the Shahid Minar is part of a marking of territory. It stakes a claim for the Bengali community within part of a longer history of migration, settlement and integration. And this is important when you think about the way in which particularly Muslim communities are positioned in that discourse at the moment. It's also about narrating a place in the present now of being part of East London at a time when in the near future that presence is already starting to decline but is likely to decline even more. So a local councillor placed the Shahid Minar as part of a Bengali and local East End heritage. He said, "The restaurant community on Brick Lane isn't secure, it will disappear. I hope not in my time. The mosque won't go, some of the businesses will remain the landmarks. The Shahid Minar, the gate, for naming some of the streets, some of the estates, some of the schools. It will take a long time for the Bangladeshis to be totally eradicated from the area, maybe in around 50 or 100 years, and who cares after that?" So again, it's that kind of notion of making a permanent mark in a very particular geographical space with a different future in mind. However, as one might expect, this cultural claiming of space isn't without its own struggles, and it's significant that the Shahid Minar is located in Altab Ali Park. Altab Ali Park was formerly known as St Mary's Churchyard. There was a big row when they tried to rename it. It was renamed in the mid-1990s in memory of a more local martyr, garment worker Altab Ali, who was murdered in a racist attack in 1978. So again, this points to the conflation of a kind of Bangladeshi national struggle with a very local East End Bengali struggle too. And a local councillor who was a teenager in the area in the 1970s told me people were living with real fear of being murdered, fear of being beaten up, fear of walking the streets safely. Through this period, though, the young men started to band together in self-defence, and a number of important youth organisations were set up and took on the National Front. The chair of the Brick Lane Mosque Committee told me, when he was much younger, almost every Sunday we had to face attacks by the skinheads and the racist National Front. In Bethnal Green, they used to sell their leaflets, and we would have to fight for it, a long, long fight, and then they moved away. A turning point was the murder of Altab Ali, a young Bengali garment worker, in 1978. And after his murder, the Bengali community organised a protest march. So the councillor told me, for the first time, Bengalis marched from Whitechapel to Parliament House, on the way round Hyde Park Corner and back to Whitechapel. It took about 8 hours. About 10,000 people. This was the first time Bengalis came out. And this was seen as a really important kind of moment in the anti-racist struggle. And that history is layered into Altab Ali Park and into the Shahid Minar. One interviewee who worked as a youth worker in the area in the 70s draw those very clear, explicit connections between this very local anti-racist struggle and the liberation struggle, so happening kind of not that far apart actually in terms of time, and saw both as central to understanding the significance of the Shahid Minar. He said Altab Ali Park had importance to the community because of the murder of Altab Ali there, and the park being a rallying point for lots of demos, meetings and protests. It was always seen as a symbol of protest and celebration. So the histories of Altab Ali Park and the Shahid Minar are closely interwoven. Many of those who shaped the youth movements in London, in East London, traced their political activism back to the liberation struggles in Bangladesh. Many of them had been active in those struggles and then had come to the UK in the kind of late 70s or early 80s as teenagers or young men in their 20s. A local businessman, for example, who was a youth worker at the time, told me, because of the liberation struggle, people were more motivated, more freedom seekers in their mind. They had to be. And another interviewee drew this very clear connection between the anti-racist struggle and the liberation struggle. He said many of the anti-racist activists of the 70s and 80s felt inspired by the Bengali independence movement, which was also inspired by the language movement, so they were all connected. So it's that kind of layering on of different meanings and different histories. However, within the Bengali community, the monument itself has been for a long time, and it remains a source of disagreement. And we can read this partly as a struggle between more Islamist-inspired groups and more secular nationalist activists. This is a bit of an over-tidy division, so it's messier than this. You can also partly read this division as a generational divide between the kind of first generation of migrants and our second and third generation who don't really care, actually, about the Shahid Minar. But the division can be mapped onto a struggle between the two most important local mosques, Brick Lane Mosque and East London Mosque. So Brick Lane Mosque, or the Jame Masjid, stands about halfway up Brick Lane and constitutes an important feature of the Tower Hamlets Heritage Trail itself. This is a very famous building, you may know it. The building was purchased by local Bangladeshis in 1976, but its history can be traced back to the 18th century, and across those intervening centuries it served as a Huguenot chapel, a Methodist chapel and a synagogue. It was a synagogue when the Bengalis bought it. So it reflects that ongoing kind of complex history of migration. The mosque's history is particularly linked to Bangladeshi community organisations such as the Bangladesh Welfare Association, which sits next door and has been going since the kind of 50s and 60s to help migrants settle. And it has close political ties to the UK Awami League, so it reflects some of these more secular nationalist ideologies of Bangladesh. So again, there's those transnational linkages. The chair of Brick Lane Mosque Committee said, quote, "It's a community-based mosque. It's basically Bangladeshi people who come here." Now, East London Mosque stands on the Whitechapel Road about 100 yards away from the entrance to Brick Lane and Altab Ali Park, you remember the map. And the mosque claims to be the oldest Muslim organisation in the area. It traces its roots back to a charity established in 1910 to serve the diverse groups of Lascars from the nearby docks. And the land for this very impressive and it's massively expanding modern building was purchased in 1975 with around half of this is what I was told, around half of the £2 million cost raised from local community donations, the other £1 million by a donation from the King of Saudi Arabia. There's some contestation about how much of that balance actually happened. The mosque opened in 1985 and it's been expanded since to include the neighbouring London Muslim Centre, shops and offices, and it's also now recently taken on a social housing project. It has future plans for an additional prayer hall and expanded facilities for women. And the executive director of East London Mosque defined its constituency in a much more inclusive, globalising term of the Muslim community. He said they come from all communities, Somali, North African, Bangladeshi, Moroccan, and all these places. It's people from all over London. And he says we have one of the youngest congregations as well. So it attracts a lot of young people that the Brick Lane Mosque tends not to. And he contrasted East London Mosque with more traditional organisations like, he didn't explicitly say Brick Lane Mosque, but he obviously meant Brick Lane Mosque. So he said most of the other mosques are run by first-generation Muslims, and they have a very narrow understanding of what mosques should be, and basically it's a replica of their village mosque in Bangladesh. Now, the people that I spoke to as part of these mosques were understandably a bit reluctant to talk about the conflict and divisions between them, but some of the other interviewees that I spoke to were more vocal about this, particularly the kind of what some of them saw as the kind of worrying dominance of East London Mosque in the area. So one member of the Nirmal Committee, which is this nationalist organisation wanting to prosecute war criminals, told me they're fundamentalists. They're very much opposed to anything Bengali. They believe they're Muslims first and foremost, and nationality, ethnicity or division should not come into it. So they don't believe in Bengali nationalism, and if they could, they would delete Bengal's history and heritage. Unsurprisingly, however, unsurprisingly, given that kind of context, you can see why the Shahid Minar and the Ekushe memorialisation has been a source of contention. Another interviewee who ran a cultural organisation and told me that he described himself as being more from the Islamic camp, told me it's ideological, the Islamists don't like it. The story is very complicated, but the Islamists don't like it for two reasons. One is that the Islamists don't like any symbols that come close to idolatry, so the Shahid Minar they see as a bit of idolatry. But also the Shahid Minar, how it's developed in Bangladesh, it's become a secularist, anti-Islamic kind of challenge. So again, you can see that intertwining of Britain and Bangladesh in these local struggles. And I interviewed representatives of both mosques, and the differences in attitude were interesting. And so the chair of Brick Lane Mosque told me that the mosque's imams opposed the shrine and the kind of the performance of the memorial, whereas he was much more pragmatic. He said, I was involved with the building of the Shahid Minar, but religiously it's two different things. I have a role as a community leader, then I have a role in the mosque management committee. The mosque can't oppose anything. The people who are religious scholars, they oppose. They make their views clear that this is not good and we shouldn't go there. But people still go there, and we as community leaders feel it's our obligation as well, and we go there. There's no tension and no conflict. He said the same thing about the Mellah, which is, again, another big source of contention about, secular and too many people having too much fun. And his line was, yes, we know it's really bad, but I kind of go because my family quite like it and my daughters like to go. So we go as a family, it's fine. The view from East London Mosque was rather different. And I spoke to two representatives there of the London Muslim Centre who told me, you see, we as Muslims have a particular way of revering those who died. We're supposed to make prayers for them and this kind of thing. Having a memorial and on the night you give flowers and all these things, it has no basis in our religion. We should pray for the ones who died in the language movement, but making a monument, no. Another told me, our own fathers and grandfathers fought in that, so obviously our hearts have an affinity with those who died, but it's a process in which you recognise them. For me, it's a personal thing. I don't have to show a wreath, for example, like is done on Poppy Day. And the chair of East London Mosque concluded firmly, that's the problem. People just make up these kinds of commemoration these days. The secular community is very much involved in this. You will not find any imams laying wreaths on 21st of February in Alta Valley Park and praying. Nobody will go. Okay, so through this very detailed little story, I want to gesture towards some of the wider paradoxes very quickly in like 2 minutes. And I think there are 4 main points to draw. Firstly, that we need to think about the role of space and place in understanding diaspora, and not simply that kind of process of moving from the place of origin to the place of settlement, but the way in which these different transnational, national and local processes and specificities shape movement and continue to do that over time, and the way in which these movements and processes are layered and intertwined with each other in quite complicated ways. Secondly, we need to place these movements temporally, and here there are two dimensions. Firstly, the role of history in explaining the settlement and the conditions for belonging or not, and the way these histories are narrated as well as part of opening up the space for belonging and claim staking. How do you operationalise those kind of historical links, if you like? And secondly, we need to recognise that these circumstances are constantly open to change and redefinition and to challenge, as the history of the Bengali community in East London in particular is, I think, captures very clearly. So this means bringing together those two different versions of diaspora, the kind of more historical and the more sociological, and doing this in a kind of making a serious attempt to do this, rather than just saying, yes, it's very important, now I'm going to just talk about multiplicity. And we need to then, thirdly, recognise processes of power in shaping diaspora movement and settlement. And this could be external through the processes of perhaps national policies, maybe border controls, inequalities and exclusions. But we also need to focus on some of those more difficult questions about what's going on internally in some of these communities, if we want to call them that, which of course are also linked to broader external forces. And this might require us to engage in some of these quite difficult, maybe unwelcome conversations. But it does also require us to deal, or to, I guess, face head on the very effective, emotionally laden discussions of identity and community, which I think have become quite unfashionable in recent years. So, lastly, and I think this is ideal in terms of your centre, there's a need for proper, rigorous, interdisciplinary and empirical work to map those theoretical terrains. Thank you. I think there might be room for reclaiming it and being more specific about what one means by it. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of leverage still in that use of it politically to lever open. I mean, my interest, because I come at it from a very particular set of agendas, which are around kind of race, ethnicity in Britain. So for me, I think there is a lot of space to open up questions of what it means to be British. I mean, the Bangladeshi Stories project that we did a follow-on piece of work with kids in schools to collect other kinds of community and family and local histories. And so we worked with a whole bunch, about 120 kids in 4 schools in Cardiff, Leicester and Sheffield. And they did family histories. And these kids were from everywhere, I mean, you know, pretty much everywhere. And we use that to engage with the notion of what one means by British history. So, you know, the history curriculum is all over the news at the moment. They want to basically go back to kings and queens and politicians. And we were kind of arguing for the need to open up a kind of more messy history from below and the kind of more complex way in which one can imagine British history and the way that different communities have made up what one means by Britain. And I think that there's space in that diaspora concept, if I'm thinking about it just in terms of the UK, for opening up what one would mean by Britain and what one would mean by British history and how one would teach that. So I think it has a strong kind of political progressive potential. I'm not sure that's always how it's used. Now, in terms of the broader kind of concept, I think it's tricky to bring a lot of, I mean, we're writing the book at the moment, and I mean, which is a little bit tentative. It's tricky to bring together what are very, very disparate groups and experiences of people under that in a meaningful sense, but except that they came from a particular place during a particular period. And maybe, you know, the spread of that is in itself interesting, the complexity of that is interesting. But I think there's more work that needs to be done with that.
And despite the diversity that you've described, they use the term or something which means the same thing for them.
I don't know if people, I mean, you know, I'm not sure how many of them actually use the term diaspora to describe themselves. I mean, it's clearly a kind of fabricated category which we imposed on them to some extent externally. So, I mean, that's an interesting question. I might have to think about that one.
Thank you. And part of the trouble is they're all fabricated categories.
Yeah,
and even if you look, if I just chip in, even classical diaspora, Jewish diaspora, African diaspora, absolute diversity. And in a way that's what's fascinating, that this sort of collectivity is carved after so much diversity. It's sort of a sort of running theme. David, next question.
The diaspora project only looked at people who had migrated at some point in their lifetime, so we didn't look at people who've been born and brought up in the UK. Because we only selected people for this project for whom the migration was a kind of important part of their experience, I guess those investments were stronger and were something that we talked because it was at the centre of what we were looking at. I think, though, what was interesting was the way they articulated those connections clearly changed over time. So a number of the women that we spoke to, well, that Shahid spoke to, he'll be able to tell you more about this, who came maybe as brides, maybe come slightly later, didn't really want to come, wanted to maintain quite strong connections with their family back in Bangladesh. But then as time went on and they had children and their children grew up here and then their partners died and they could go back to Bangladesh, but they decided not to because their notion of what home is had shifted to here. So there's those kind of lifetime connections and the way in which those changed. And there was some quite interesting stuff that I think we came across around burials where people wanted to be buried. People who would assume they would want to go back to be buried in Bangladesh realised that all their family had gone, so actually they wanted to be buried here because at least those kind of rituals could be done around that. So I think, I think it changed over time. Now, what happens in terms of the next generation down and their children and those connections? So I've just been redoing this Asian Gang project with Bengali young men who are now no longer actually that young, and talking to them about some of those connections. Some of them married back in Bangladesh, and there's been quite interesting stuff around the tensions around why they felt they had to do that, why some of them decided not to do that, what some of the problems had been, but also things like a number of them who've been quite successful who are now investing back in Bangladesh, but not in land and not in building supermarkets in that kind of complex way, but investing in kind of charities or teaching young orphans in Dhaka to play football, or so there are various kinds of return investments and connections, but are not the ones that people normally write about. So it's not necessarily about remittances, it's not necessarily about family land and those kind of overdevelopments of select that I know Katie Garden has talked about. There are other versions of that happening which I'd need to think a bit more about, but so I think cross-generationally those investments are different potentially, although the marriage one is an interesting thing to think about across the two projects. So I'd have to think a bit more about that. I honestly don't know would be my answer. I mean, I did a very little I was very interested in very particular issues. I mean, my sense is that probably those investments have changed a lot generationally. So I think you're talking about a very particular generation of people who have very particular links, which may be why a number of people are not interested. I think that I don't know enough about East London. I mean, I think it's got, there's that John Eade study done from the late 80s, which makes that argument and makes the argument very clearly that those loyalties then feed into the way in which the Labour Party gets shaped in East London. And I mean, you hear gossip, right, and anecdotes, and the way in which local politics is shaped by political interests and alliances back in Bangladesh. Still, I honestly don't know. I mean, it's not something that I looked at. I mean, you would know much more about it than me. And I think, the Islamist thing, I guess it depends what you mean by Islamist. I mean, I think of the way in which that gets cast around as being somehow an insult. I mean, the guy that I quoted, for example, described himself as, from the Islamic camp and was kind of proud. So I'm assuming he's not meaning by that the way that other people might, Ed Hussein is kind of casting around that term. So
I was just going to also say, your study has hit the nail on the head. I think you did a fantastic piece of work. I think it's really detailed. But in terms of the youth identity, what I found is that a lot of young Bangladeshis in East London tend not to identify themselves any longer with their Bangladeshi heritage. It's now with the Ummah, the Muslim community. From your research, did you find there was a conflict there among the young people?
I mean, we didn't. I mean, this project was just focused on first-generation migrants. Some of whom were quite young because they may have come as brides or they may have come as kind of to work in a restaurant or something. But in terms of, we didn't look at British-born, and the Asian Gang project that I did was not in East London. So, and East London, I think, is a very specific space with its own set of dynamics, which I kind of hesitate to comment on any further than that, really. I think, if I think about the other Bangladeshi heritage young people that I know, I think there's not really, the Shahid Minar people are not interested, I suspect. I talked to some of the young men from the Asian Gang project about this project, and they don't know. And one of their nieces came to a thing we did for the Bangla Stories launch, and she said to me, we had Amitav Ghosh came and did this launch, and he was talking about when he was asked to run away to sea and how this would have affected his career as a novelist or an anthropologist. And she said afterwards, one of my uncles was a Lascar, but I never really knew what that meant. So I think there is probably quite a big gap. And so a number of these first generation activists were saying, look, my daughter goes to a local school, she wants to wear the hijab. I don't really want her to do that, but that's what she wants. So I think there is that generational shift, I guess. I wouldn't want to call it a conflict because I'm not a big believer in that whole kind of generational conflict stuff. But I think there's certainly a shift. There was that whole big row about the Brick Lane book, wasn't there? I mean, the Monica Ali thing about whether or not she had or had not described Soletas as being kind of dirty and uneducated. We didn't really come across much of... No, actually, no, that's not true. We did speak to a number of people that had come later in the kind of 90s from Dhaka who were saying, this area is dominated by Silet and they're all completely uneducated and poor and it's embarrassing. But on the whole, I don't think it was particularly kind of explicit in terms of how people interacted with each other. I don't know. I mean, what is the percentage? Something like 85% of the Bengali community is from Sylhet. So they're pretty dominant as a group. But I think that's linked. God, this is going to sound. This may not even be true. So let me say this, then if it's wrong, people can put me right. My feeling is that the Sylheti population that came slightly earlier and have a slightly different class profile. So I think that some of those tensions that people read as Sylheti, non-Sylheti might actually be about class to some extent. And it also might be about migration histories, people that came at a particular moment. So again, I think you can untangle that as much as one would want to, rather than just, people would code it as, Sylheti versus Dhaka or whatever. But I think it's probably, again, more complicated than that. And the next generation down, I'm not sure do people care? Although, talking to some of the Asian gang boys, men, it did come up in terms of marriage choices and things like that, which was kind of interesting, and I hadn't expected. But I don't know how big an issue it was. We also did talk to, Shahzad will be able to tell you more about this, but we spoke to some Bengali Hindus, Bangladeshi Hindus, and they were a whole different kind of network of people. But again, with interesting connections and solidarities across what one would think of as a religious divide. So, yeah. Does that answer it?
People sometimes care unexpectedly, don't they? Because of local events.
Right.
Suddenly become very significant about what they want to trace themselves back to. The sort of research I'm doing, sometimes you find an Indian kid who's never been home and, will absolutely insist they're Indian first and foremost, despite the fact they've grown up here, etc., and that's been sparked by a certain incident or something. So it's just not linear, is it, or evolutionary. It tends to sort of erupt at certain moments and subside in others quite often.
I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, the people that I spoke to that came over in the 70s or early 80s and were part of those youth movements, who were the most fascinating group of people. I mean, those youth movements, I would love to know more about the youth movement. I know there's some work that's been done on it. But the connections that they talked about around, so they've got these guys who are mainly Bengali Muslims at that point, but they had connections. So they're working locally with the socialist workers, they're working locally with kind of local white communities, Jewish communities, there's that whole history which they were all very aware of, the kind of Battle of Cable Street. But, the East End has always been a very complex area, and they talked a lot about how when they came, Bengalis were not in the majority, they were in the minority. There were a lot of Pakistanis, lots of Indians, and they were all kind of in these anti-racist movements, were much more multi-ethnic. And then they had connections with, what was going on in Southall, what was going on in Birmingham or Bradford, or, so those connections, which are completely cross racial and ethnic and religious divides. Those are there, and it would be interesting to see much more work on that. And I think that generation seemed to have, in some ways, not inclusive. It's inclusive in a different way from that, because you can also argue that the Muslim identity thing is also an inclusive version of that. But they seem to have a quite kind of, they were interested in alliances, so that wasn't part of the way in which they saw themselves at that point. I think potentially being Muslim was not necessarily an important part in the 70s and 80s of some of those. And when they get into local politics in the 80s and 90s, the community is much bigger because their families have come over and kind of from the late 80s onwards. And then numerically they're dominant, which is what allows them to enter into local Labour Party politics and then effectively take over the council at that point, push through the Bangalore Town stuff and so on. So I think it depends at what point you're talking about, and I think there are always those alliances. One of the things that I did find though, because I'm not Bangladeshi, but my mother's Bengali Hindu, and all the people I interviewed would always ask me, usually at the end of the interview, they say, "Oh, so are you a Bengali?" And I say, "Well, my mother's Bengali Hindu, but and they would be like, "Oh, well, so you're one of us then." So it's not quite as so there is a very strong sense of Bengali identity, Bengali language and culture amongst certain groups of people, which wasn't actually exclusive in that way. It wasn't like, that kept they weren't interested in making alliances with other people. And so I think it depends when you're talking about and who you're talking about, probably. I mean, I think it's probably true that in the discourses, people tend now to think in terms of those religious divides, but I think people are aware of those bigger connections, and I mean, and if not, that's kind of deeply troubling. In fact, there's the community history project we've been working on, the Bengal Diaspora one, became the Archbishop of Canterbury apparently is very keen on getting partition taught, put on the national curriculum as a way of explaining some of those divides. So I mean, it may be that there'll be more of that sense of commonality engendered. I don't know, or possibly not. I suppose it could backfire, but
I mean, it's another problem, isn't it, with the category of diaspora, because it's not stable.
Right.
It's very fluid, isn't it, about who it includes and excludes, and sort of depending on the situation.
I don't know if you've read Hilary Mantel's autobiography. She has a very interesting interview at the end where she basically says that actually people think they're learning about people through autobiography, whereas actually what they're getting is a highly selective, much more selective picture actually than the stuff that seeps through in her novels, because you can choose and you can highlight and focus particular angles, and then other bits you just don't mention at all. And I guess that automatically happens with those kind of life history interviews. And also because we were interested in a very particular story, which was the migration journey and story. So of course large amounts of people's other bits of their lives get kind of quashed from that. But there were little unexpected kind of gems that came through, I think. I mean, Shahzad got some wonderful stuff from kind of women that came as brides that talked about how lonely they'd been and how they would, watch people walking past them in the street and think that the person looks like one of their relatives back in Bangladesh. I mean, so we got some really nice material, but it's a very partial picture. And the things we chose to focus on were in, we had to so my colleague is an Indian historian, and so her take on the question of marriage, for example, and marriage migration was very different from mine as a sociologist, and we had a bit of a struggle over what one could say about that without, wanting to feed into some potentially quite negative, broader political stories about migration and migration control. So there were wrangles, and no doubt there'll continue to be more. I mean, I think that the discourse around whether one can be a British Muslim and how one is a British Muslim is absolutely about the question of integration. And then by integration, depending on who it is that you're asking, right, but pretty much if you're a Tory minister, integration is, are you like me? Are you becoming more like me? Did you go to Eton? And, so I think that those discussions absolutely impact on the way in which people I mean, a lot of this stuff, not this stuff, but the Shahid Minar and the Bangla towns, that whole move towards that is absolutely about the desire to claim space on particular kinds of terms, of being equal, of being, I mean, the restaurant trade is worth, what, £4 billion a year or something to the UK? If you want to talk about integration, we're talking about quite, really quite integrated. This kind of stuff really winds me up about the Bangladeshi community, because it always gets seen as being a group that have failed, that are poor, that are disengaged, that are busy doing lots of kind of reactionary things like marrying their children back home. And actually, I think a lot of it depends on what one means by integration. I mean, East London Mosque is interesting because I mean they've got a very strong discourse of we are British Muslims and we work in Britain and it's completely compelling. But I think there are other versions of what one means by integration into Britain, which the Bengali community is particularly interesting because of that very long history of working on the railways in India, working in the Navy, working in the sweatshops in the East End, and so that history of integration is always, depending on what one means by that, always been there. And I think the discourses around Muslimness are absolutely questions of belonging and integration, and not about questions of equality, which I think is the more interesting question. In terms of the Burnley stuff, but I mean, Shahzad did work in Oldham, and it's qualitatively the kinds of engagements with the broader community seem to be quite different. Partly, I think, because in East London, a lot of the Bengalis there did enter into local politics, which seems to have made quite a big difference. In Oldham, less so, and they seem to, I think, I'm trying to kind of remember the various interviews now, but seem to have grown stronger through that period of multiculturalism and funding and reliance on state funding, which is slightly different from what happened in London. But of course, the external context is different in Burnley and Oldham and those kind of, Burnley in particular, where you've got that very strong BNP presence and it's been there for the last 10 years or so, kind of strong in the council kind of framing. So of course that's going to, and also processes of housing segregation and so on. And again, both of those areas have complex kind of histories of housing segregation. The housing movement in East London through the kind of 70s and 80s, and you know the role of the Liberal Party in segregating ethnic minorities and so on is complicated. I mean, it's absolutely, those kinds of levels of integration are absolutely shaped, I think, in terms of employment, education, housing, by those kind of interactions with broader British society. I think some of those things are starker in the north now. They may not have, I think it was pretty stark in East London in the 70s and 80s. Yeah. So I think that's probably a historical shift. I mean, the demography is interesting too, because it's changing. I mean, the Bengali community is, 30-something% of Tower Hamlets. That's getting less, increasing Eastern Europeans, increasing Somalis. So in some senses, those Bangladeshis in East London are now the establishment and the ones that other people are having to kind of negotiate with to get access to certain kind of things. So I think that is itself quite interesting.